Today's featured speaker is Frank McLean, Senior Analyst and Training Practice Lead as part of the Cyber Incident Response Team at Red Canary.
Thank you, Carol. This talk is a little bit more of a soft nature, maybe slightly different than what you would expect in a venue like this. But I find that the older I get, the more I find myself wanting to impart knowledge of a non-technical nature. Plus, there are a lot of very sharp people coming up in the industry that are excellent at sharing very technical topics, far better than I would ever be. And I also think that having these types of talks is important and that our future depends on it. Now, that's not from a doom and gloom type perspective, but from one of actually changing the future. My hope is that this can serve as kind of an olive branch to get those conversations started. So a little about me. I came out of small business IT focused roles into DFIR consulting in 2007. And after paying my dues for a few years there, I moved into a corporate InfoSec role where I built out and led the operations team as well as our DFIR and e-discovery functions. So I've been on the service side with Red Canary for a little over 2 years now. And I get to identify and analyze threats against our customers' environments there. To me, this is a lot of fun as I get to do what I call the fun stuff. And I don't have to fix anything. I don't end up having to get up in the middle of the night, responding to alerts or calls or things of that nature, figuring out the scope of compromise and so on. When I'm not analyzing threats, I may be playing Scottish fiddle, translating that to mandolin, mountain biking, or occasionally drinking good whiskey. In recent weeks, I've been working on some renovations in our home, replacing kitchen backsplash and things of this nature. It's been a lot of work, but it's also been a lot of fun and good to get outside of the technical arena a bit. So here's the deal. We have a problem as an industry. It's industry-wide, doesn't seem to be going away. And to be honest, we're probably not the only industry with this type of problem, but we can only do our part and work on our fire. And typically, when you hear of layer 8 in technology, it has a negative connotation. Somebody messed up. They did something they shouldn't have. Typically viewed as something they should have known better than to do. So we do have a layer 8 problem, but it's from the overarching aspect, not the somebody messed up aspect. We hear all the time that we have a shortage of qualified people in InfoSec. I don't think anybody challenges that statement. We talk about the need to hire newcomers who obviously know very little about InfoSec, about accepting people from different backgrounds and experience levels. And then we complain because these people who have no background or experience in InfoSec have no background or experience in InfoSec. Now, that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the newcomers, it doesn't help the old timers, and it doesn't help employers. So if you think that I'm saying that our problem is somewhat circular, you're absolutely right. And this is largely because the way that we're doing things in this area doesn't seem to be working very well. So part of the responsibility may lie with the culture, but that's a little bit of a different people problem. If we're going to bring in newcomers, whether that's from schools, different industries, military, etc., we have to really invest in them. We have to prepare them to have a fulfilling career in InfoSec. And let's be honest, that not only doesn't happen in schools, it cannot happen in that venue. It's far too separated from the reality of how things actually work or don't work. Everyone listening to the webcast, where you are, if you learned everything that you needed to know in school, please raise your hand. Now, I know without looking, that nobody has their hand up. That's exactly the point. And finally, when we do get good people, however we get them, from wherever we get them, we want to keep them around as long as we reasonably can. We all can benefit from some longevity in that area. So when we're hiring, we talk about getting people who can hit the ground running. It's a very common phrase. And this is because it costs too much money to get people up to speed. Another common phrase. It costs too much money having people jumping jobs every few months or even every couple of years. So the average of what I've heard is that it takes roughly a year to start recouping the initial cost of hiring someone. A year. So if somebody's changing jobs every 6 months to every couple of years, as an employer, you're still upside down on that investment. And the business has needs, right? The business has to make money. Every business is in business for that purpose. So what happens is we toss people into the fire, we burn them out, and then we move on to the next one. And it's a failing cycle that should seem obvious to all of us. So I've been in the industry for well over a decade, and I've seen, as I'm sure many of you have as well, the turnover, not just directly in our own companies, but among our friends and acquaintances. I gave a talk a couple years ago at the SANS DFIR Summit entitled Musashi Forensics. It's out on YouTube for anybody that's interested. It's just a 6-minute lightning talk that hit on the problem of people jumping ships and kind of some of the things that play into that from the back end. And I think it's still valid and part of our overall problem. Now, specific to security operations, we seem to have a lot of you can't do that at given levels, especially in SOC type work. So those newcomers we're trying so hard to bring in, the low-level analysts, they aren't allowed to do anything but triage and escalate the quote-unquote important things to somebody else who knows what they're doing. It's inefficient, and it's certainly not fulfilling. It doesn't allow room for people to grow. And so as soon as someone gets to a point where they think they know something, they think they have value to impart, they leave because they're already fed up with everything. Those senior people that do stick around and do their job well are essentially forced into management in order to gain more responsibility, get advances, pay increases, etc., whether they want it or not. And for the majority of technical people, moving into management is not a good option. We simply have to have a path to be able to avoid that. Now, if you're gathering that this is something that I'm passionate about, that's important to me, you're right. And I think that this is important to all of us in various ways. So to help set the stage for the things that are coming next, I'm going to tell a little story about me. And it may be very much like what many of you have experienced in the past. And this is centered around how I came to join Red Canary and kind of what I experienced starting out here. But it's really not that different from things that I've had in the past myself. So I started with Red Canary, like I said earlier, a little over 2 years ago. And at the time, I made the 10th person working there. I was the 4th hire for the analyst team, for an analyst team that all worked remote. And as with many jobs, it kind of went the same way to start off. One difference that we had was our CEO tasked me with taking copious notes on what I thought worked, what I thought didn't, and so on, since I was very much an outsider at that point. I was the new person coming in. The good thing is they recognized the potential for problems and they were actively looking for ways to identify and fix them. So I flew to Denver, which is where Red Canary is based, and I spent roughly 4 days there. Realistically, it was 3 days of training with our lead analyst who lives in the Denver area but still works remote from the office. He came into the office, spent time with me, so I flew in Monday morning, I flew out Thursday afternoon. So basically 3 days of working. Then I headed back home to work remotely on my own. It was a bit of a challenge. There had been almost a year from their last analyst hire, and there were so many changes occurring in that time that everybody else just knew because they had worked through that process. But it was too much information to absorb without a formal program of any sort. So it's a good thing that everyone was open to change. Now, if we keep doing things the way we've been doing them as an industry, we're not going to improve, right? It's the definition of insanity, right? You keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect to get different results. So we identified things that were important to us and started figuring out ways to meet those as strategic objectives. Now, this seems to be the obvious approach, but what I've commonly observed is that as people and as an industry, we establish what we think the outcomes should be and work backward from there. It's subtly different, as the outcome of a given approach is simply part of the previously defined objective. So to this point, a few months ago, there was a conversation on an email list. Somebody posted the question stating that they wanted to stand up a 24/7 SOC, and they were seeking opinions on the best way to set up the shifts for this. And unfortunately, this is a common type of approach, but one that I think is backwards, since it doesn't address the actual need. Do you need a 24-hour coverage in a SOC? That's the primary question, right? And so from there, trying to arbitrarily apply shifts and work schedules is like dropping a lit match onto a Pepsi can half filled with gasoline. Not that I've ever done that, just saying the results that you get might not be exactly what you expect. So here's where we are now, right? We'll go through these in more detail, but this kind of breaks down 4 key areas that we've worked to make improvements to help not only our onboarding process, but retention and everything else along the way. So we've built out a training program that allows us to have a repeatable process to help new analysts, regardless of their specific experience coming in, to become fully functional and self-sufficient within a month. It's the same kind of thing to me as coming out of the forensics arena. You need a repeatable process so that anybody picking it up can go through the exact same steps that you went through and come up with the exact same results. Now, some of the conclusions drawn may be different, but the starting point should be the same. I have no doubt that we will change and streamline this program over time. Heck, we've changed it over just the last month. But for the time being, I don't see it becoming much shorter. There's simply too much knowledge to impart. And I won't even say like just to junior analysts. The way that we do things is different. And even experienced people coming on have to relearn things. We'll get more into that in just a bit. So it's important to us that documentation reflects what we do. Really, this is the big thing with documentation, right? And it's part of the challenge with any kind of documentation project. But for us, with the operational things that we do, it's important that the document shows what we do, how we do it, and why. And if it doesn't, it's pretty much useless to us. So we've developed internal resources to help answer questions, to serve as a source of record for how we do things. Naturally, these change over time. And if they or their contents are no longer relevant, then they're changed or purged as needed. That's kind of been a lot of our focus. If something doesn't work for us, let's change it, let's make it work, and let's move on. And part of our process as well is that we've all seen or experienced pain from a tiered structure. And this is a bit of a pet peeve for many of us. So yes, we have more senior people and we have more junior people, but we all do the same job. Our job descriptions are the same. And we all have the freedom and the responsibility to do the fun things. Things like developing new ways to detect evil, streamline operations, improve efficiency, train others, go, purposefully threat hunting outside of the work that we normally do. Things of this nature, even writing blog posts and giving talks, presentations. And if somebody wants to dive in with DevOps on a project or work on our Atomic Red Team testing framework, those opportunities exist for everyone on the team as well. Obviously, it's not a free-for-all. It can't be. We are still a business. We have to get our core job done. And we are all still responsible for that primary job of getting out timely and actionable detections to our customers. And in order to provide ways for our people to continue to develop, expand skill sets, and increase their responsibilities, but without having to move into management, we started the concept of different practices within kind of our security operation group. These are all areas that are important to what we do and how we do it, such as detector development, right? Coming up with new ways to find evil, analysis and workflow efficiencies so that we don't have as much toil in our day, giving us more free time to do other things, threat intelligence, training. Each of these practices is led by a senior analyst who has an interest in that area, although not necessarily prior experience. And that senior analyst is responsible for the direction and accountability of that practice. And we also spearhead any broader or company-wide project-related items for our group. So here's where we start going deeper into that 4-week training of new hires. Now, you may be a little surprised to hear that it's 4 weeks. After all, that means that analysts are going to be taken out of production in order to train somebody coming on new. That's absolutely correct. That's something that we expect, and that's something that we accept. We also don't expect that any of our analysts are doing 100% of working events anyway, and training is considered to be something that's extremely important to us. And since we all work remotely, we train the same way, keeping the same kind of workflow. There's no more going to Denver for a few days. We use screen sharing, video calls, things of that nature to be able to communicate and go through the process. So our training matrix is basically a listing of topics that tie in directly with our operational handbook, which in turn relates directly to our work, our workflow, processes, and decision points. This helps us to be thorough and consistent throughout the entire process. And everybody on the team has a hand in training new analysts across all shifts. We realize that everybody learns and teaches differently, and having that variety helps on both sides of the equation. Not only does the trainee have a better chance of connecting and engaging with the team at large, especially since we're remote, they also have more opportunities to learn things the way that they learn. And at the same time, our existing analysts learn more by having to teach somebody else, right? It goes back to that point of you don't really learn a subject until you have to teach it. Now, this has led to a number of improvements in different areas, which is it's a great thing. That's a huge win. And as kind of stated before, we do all this remotely. New hires aren't going to Denver anymore the way that I did. Now, our training days are based on a core 8-hour day, starting off mostly during core business hours. Again, they will kind of shift through working on all the different shifts throughout the process to give that greater exposure. Day one starts off with your typical onboarding stuff, HR things, getting accounts set up, etc. Then it switches over to training, and we review the matrix and set expectations for the coming weeks. On day two, we get into doing actual event analysis with the training analyst driving, showing and explaining our interface, workflow, analysis process, etc. When we first started this, as an example of some ways that we've changed things, the whole first week was the new hire simply shoulder surfing, through screen sharing. But we found that they typically wanted to go faster than that. And with quality candidates, even those with little actual experience in the area and a better training process, we could start upping the ante. So what we do now, realistically, the second half of the week, the training analyst still drives, but the trainee is trying to apply what they've learned by guiding the analyst through the process to the extent that they can. So if they say, I think this, I think that, go over here, look at that, sort of thing. And when they get stuck, the analyst can kind of help move them along to the next point. The idea is it's not about remembering all the things, but building on what they've already learned and retained to that point. We find that it helps to start this way rather than saying, okay, now you drive, because then they have to both remember and do. So if we take the do out of it and just say remember, then that helps kind of ease into that process a little bit better, reduces the stress, and improves the results. And thus we find that by the second week, trainees are generally ready to start driving on their own with some monitoring. Right? What we typically do is we'll have an open call with screen sharing. The trainer pays very close attention to what the trainee is doing, but gives the freedom to fumble around and find their own way, ask questions, and so on. And as it progresses through the process, that becomes less of an active session, more of a just in the background kind of thing. Which gets us to the third week, where what we find is the trainee should be largely independent by this point. There's usually an open call, but not necessarily screen sharing, and possibly no open call at all, depending on how well the analyst is doing. And either of those things, call or screen sharing, can be engaged as needed. And the trainee can also reach out to anybody else on the team. It's not just their assigned trainer for that day. We make sure during this week that we schedule time with each practice lead so that they can explain their responsibilities in greater detail, kind of what that practice is all about, how it fits into the bigger picture, and that sort of thing. If any test environments are needed for things like, detector development, those can be stood up at that time. And based on feedback from the team as a whole, we determine if the trainee is ready to start flying solo, going towards their final schedule. We've talked about at different times having some type of a validation test. We haven't quite gotten there yet. Don't know if we will or not, but it's something that's been kicked around. Just so far hasn't seemed like it's fit into the process. So the fourth week is kind of a catch-up week, if needed, to help reinforce any of the concepts from the prior 3 weeks. Regardless of how the trainee is doing, they're still working kind of the core hours at this point, on their own, independent, but not their final schedule. So most of our analysts work 4/10s, and so this week 4, we'll start kind of shifting them towards that final work schedule, making sure that they've got a weekend, so to speak, before their regular shift starts. So we want our analysts to have exposure to everyone on the team, right? To have the greatest potential for connecting, building relationships, and understanding how we work. By pairing them up with the rest of the team, working on all the shifts, they not only get greater exposure to people in training, but also better familiarity with the types of events seen on different shifts. It's a lot different at 2 in the morning than it is at 2 in the afternoon. And our trainers aren't locked into you teach this or you teach that. Within the context of the matrix and other training materials and process, they have the freedom to focus on the areas that seem most relevant at that time, which also helps the trainees to learn more efficiently and effectively. So we don't expect our new people to come out of training knowing all the things, but we do expect them to be able to do that core job with confidence and independence, right? And kind of that core thing is getting timely and actionable detections out to our customers. Now, from what I've observed, both directly and indirectly, and much of our team as well, throwing people into the fire, as seems most common, you spend a couple days with somebody and then you're on your own, is not really working. It leads to problems of skill gap, job satisfaction, career progression, retention, and talent shortages. There's no doubt that we're facing significant challenges ahead, a long road to hoe, as they say. But I'm confident that if we approach this conscientiously and are deliberate in the way that we deal with our people problem, that we can make a positive difference on it. So I say that we can change the future, and I say that with confidence because we already are. From where we were roughly 2 years ago at Red Canary, we've already changed the future. The future from then is now, and we're going to keep working diligently to change that for tomorrow, next month, next year, and on down the road. And I think that if we as an industry work together, we recognize and acknowledge that we have a problem or a number of problems with the way that we deal with our new hires and our retention issues as a whole. We work together. We start trying to come up with new ways to do things. If it doesn't work, we'll change it, right? And keep changing it so that we get something that does work. Now, I'm not saying that what we've got here is the answer. It's an answer that's working for us right now, but we've changed it significantly. And like I said, we continue to change it. And our focus is on continuing to do that as needed. So if we all work together doing this type of thing, I think we can make a huge difference. So are you ready? Let's work together. Let's have conversations. Let's make a difference for the future. And Carol, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
All right, well, thank you for that great presentation. We have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenter, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first question is, would you be willing to share examples of your documentation? How are you documenting the responses?
So I'm not sure the second part of the question about documenting responses. With regard to our documentation, obviously some of our internal processes are just that, internal, right? But essentially what we've tried to do, since the platform that we work in is our own, we're not using a SIM or some other some other type of ready-made off-the-shelf type thing. We are in full, we've got full charge of that platform that we work in, the workflow and everything else. We've tried to capture that workflow in our documentation so that we kind of can start from the beginning. Anybody coming on, as they go through the process of learning, they've got something to reference, right? We've got screenshots in there of some of those specific areas, pointing out facets or areas of interest within the interface that will go towards that analytical process. Again, the whole point is that we're trying to make sure that our people have the skills that they need to do their primary job. All the other stuff, the ancillary things, can come over time. But having that kind of that record of what are the primary things that we do and how do we do them comes into play. And so that will include things like not just process, workflow, but then also some decision points. Do we call something, what's the severity level that we call things, and how do we determine what that is? It's not arbitrary. Although ultimately everything is an analyst decision, we try to provide some guidelines around that so that we have consistency throughout the process.
All right, thanks, Frank. How do you maintain the motivation about security? Monitoring tends to be tedious and exhausting.
Yes, it certainly can. And that's one of the things that we try to do. Like I said, having a practice area that focuses on kind of our engineering aspects to help improve efficiencies, to help reduce some of that toil, right? Is there a way that we can do things more quickly, more efficiently? I'm not going to say necessarily faster, because a lot of places focus on, how many events can you process in X amount of time, right? Or you've got to close this within the next minute, or you're behind, that sort of thing. And we don't approach it that way. What we do is try to watch like our various detectors. And so a detector is a behavioral signature in essence for activity. If we have a detector that's creating too much noise, the kind of thing that makes analysts just want to click the button next, then we have kind of those pain points to analyze, look at and say, okay, this is something that we need to fix. Let's not just keep clicking through it. Let's not complain about it. Let's actually get in there and fix the problem. And I think that's one of the things that helps with kind of motivation and morale overall, is we are in charge of our destiny, as it were. And so we have that opportunity to go in and fix things and make things better for ourselves not just say, well, it's the way it is, click next, click next, click next.
All right, thank you. This next question says, Frank, I am a tier 1 analyst who did not receive 95% of what you discussed here. I am now on weekend nights, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., working with another tier 1. After 4 months on the job, I feel my skills and development have been significantly hindered. What do you recommend for someone in my position at this time?
That's tough. I mean, a 12-hour shift is tough by itself, right? If you have the opportunity in any way, and I would say simply, the big thing is have a conversation with whomever you report to. If there's a team lead or even manager, whatever that step is, the next person above you, have a conversation with them. Explain that you would like to be involved in other things. Look for opportunities, look for ways that can happen. If there is downtime on your shift where it's not just the continual pounding through events, look for other ways that you may be able to, within the context that you're allowed, obviously, learn other things, figure out other ways that you may be able to contribute to things to help set you apart from people who may be continuing to be content with just sitting there clicking a button. If it frustrates you, look for ways that you can learn and grow within that context. Have those conversations. And also, as you can on your own time, when you're not at work, look for ways that you can expand your knowledge base. And, specifically in areas that are going to benefit you at where you are currently, as well as where you'd like to be in the future, right? Not necessarily 6 months from now, but a year or 2 years, wherever you have goals that you want to be, that you want to work with. Some of that is going to be contingent upon the efforts that you take, both inside and outside of the job. I hope that helps. I know it's a tough position to be in.
All right, thank you. Are there prescribed investigation or analytical defined frameworks to base teaching investigations upon, either openly available or used internally?
I'm not sure that there are anything defined in that respect. Obviously, there's organizations like SANS that have excellent curriculums that have been developed, but those are all based on the expertise of the people developing the individual courses. I don't know that there's a specific framework for that. I'm not sure what that would look like. The closest thing that I can think of just off the top of my head is the training matrix that we use, which again is just basically kind of a topical breakdown of the things that we will go through. And so that includes, things as basic as what are the communication platforms we use and how we use them, denoting things like making sure that we're not having sensitive client information places that it's not supposed to be, keeping comms to a minimum with regard to sensitive references and things of that nature, how we do stuff out of band communications, that sort of thing, as well as going through the process of kind of breaking down and explaining the interface that we use, navigating through that, and kind of what the workflow is, where people can find the resources that they need in our documentation to answer questions, kind of core people on the team that have certain areas of expertise that may be able to answer questions, in certain regards, and things of that nature to help have something that's repeatable. but that's all very much internal to the way that we work and the processes that we have and the way that we do analysis and whatnot. What I've found is that every place that you go, regardless of your experience, that the processes are different, right? I had a considerable amount of experience both in forensics and IR and working in corporate environment in the financial industry before coming in here. And there was a lot of stuff that I needed to really kind of relearn in a number of ways, simply because of the way that we do things internally and differently, the way that our focus is and whatnot. So I think any kind of a framework is going to be largely dependent upon the environment to which it applies. That's a great question. It gives me something to think about, because we've got frameworks for so many things, but I don't know that there's any for training.
All right, thank you. How do you build confidence in analysts to know what is okay or suspicious or malicious without overconfidence?
Part of that is trying to make sure that again, we have kind of these decision points, or is something suspicious versus malicious. And a big thing there is, if we can say specifically what it is, whether that's a specific binary that's known to be malicious, or it's a set of processes or process execution that is known to fit a malicious pattern, right? If you've got somebody doing like a PowerShell Empire type thing, there's a pattern of behavior there that we know is malicious. Maybe it's just red team, but we don't really know and we don't really care, right? The pattern of behavior is malicious. So if we can define it that way, then we can put it in that bucket. If it doesn't look normal, right? The whole thing of, find evil by knowing what normal is. If it doesn't look normal, but we can't put our finger on it specifically to say this is something that we know is bad, then it falls more into a suspicious bucket. But as far as building that, kind of building that confidence and reinforcing that, every detection that we push out to customers that is either malicious or suspicious gets reviewed by another analyst, right? So there's another set of eyes that gets on that prior to it being published to the customer, so that we've got not only that, that kind of that safety net, but also more input to add greater context. Somebody may be really familiar with one thing because they've seen it, investigated it, done some research on it, and they may be able to help flesh that out to put additional notes for the customer, that sort of thing, to help the customer understand what it is that we're seeing and the significance of that. Also, at any time, if somebody isn't sure about a thing, even just, hey, how bad is this? They can post that question to everybody on the team, and everybody can kind of jump on that and provide some additional input or insight to it. So essentially, we try to make it so that it's the same as if you're sitting next to somebody shoulder to shoulder in a cube or whatever, and you say, hey, Bob, Joe, Jane, whatever, take a look at this. What does this look like to you? To help build that understanding, share information and knowledge, and build the confidence along the way. And at the same time, having that peer review process also helps ensure that somebody doesn't just kind of think all the things are evil because that's really fun and cool and everything to find all the evil stuff and chase off down the rabbit hole, et cetera, et cetera. So we have some checks and balances built in, as well as that opportunity to communicate with the team at large.
All right, thanks, Frank. A couple of people are asking a similar question. This one specifically says, I have worked in an LE setting doing digital forensics for the past 7 years. What can I do to expand my skill sets and make myself more marketable in the InfoSec or IR industry? And what a couple people asked is, do you recommend any specific certifications or training? I know you touched on it briefly, so I'm not sure if you have more to add.
Yeah, so obviously if you've got a background that's very focused on digital forensics, that's great. You should have a very good understanding of the underlying nature of operating systems. I would hazard a guess predominantly Windows, with maybe some Mac and Linux thrown in there. All of that understanding is going to be beneficial. Branching out to make yourself more marketable and being able to break into private sector areas, especially with regard to kind of incident response type things. Obviously, there's some aspects besides the traditional dead box forensics. Got to get a little more in the live arena, if you will. And so understanding things about, system internals as things are happening on a system, memory analysis, malware analysis, doesn't have to be deep dive into reverse engineering on malware, but having that understanding, even just running things through an isolated test lab where you set up an environment to mimic the real world, where malware is able to do netcons and you're doing just dynamic monitoring of it. That's going to be hugely beneficial. As well as if you can get further into, the kind of the debugging side of things and disassembling, that's great. Understanding how malware works, understanding how attackers work, aside from the malware that they may use. Big things right now are, the living off the land in Windows with PowerShell stuff. There's a lot of we'll say testing frameworks out there, things like PowerShell Empire, Bloodhound, stuff like that are readily used not just by red teams, but also by attackers. If not specifically that framework, at least the concepts of that framework. They're going to follow the same type of pattern, and understanding what those are, what those look like. If you can set up a lab and run through those yourself, to gain a better understanding of what it looks like to go through the process, both as an attacker, but then also as a defender, what does it look like on the back end? And, gathering that monitoring type data, especially in a Windows environment, you can stand up Sysmon very easily and log that data, use that data to, to go through and figure out what the attack chain looks like. Where are ways that you can identify that as early as possible and start to gain a feel for kind of that overall process flow. I think all those kinds of things will help get you in a position to be more marketable and able to leverage that knowledge, for other types of jobs in other industries. And of course, there's all the SANS training in the area, right?
All right, thank you. Do you really find it helpful to eliminate tiers for analysis work? What happens if someone doesn't understand what they're looking at?
Yeah, so I definitely find it helpful, and I think this is an important thing, and maybe not from as much from the standpoint of clicking through events, right? Get through as many events as possible in the shortest amount of time as possible. Not really from that standpoint. Sure, from that standpoint, having tiered analysts maybe makes sense. But if you're not trying to just click through as many events as possible in as short a time as possible, then it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference for the individual. Because one of the things that I've seen over and over again that leads to burnout is that toil. And a tier one analyst job is essentially nothing but toil, and they don't get to do anything fun. If they come across something that they think, hey, this might actually be interesting, they have to escalate it to tier two. And then tier 2 takes a little bit further, and then they escalate it to tier 3. And nobody gets anything from that, right? All you get is disgruntled employees, basically. So I think that it's hugely beneficial from that standpoint. From the standpoint of, what if they don't understand something? Again, it goes back to that point of us having peer review. So, and open communication on, anybody can post to our internal group chat to say, hey, I'm looking at this event. I'm not sure. Is this bad, or, is my tinfoil hat on too tight? This sort of thing, so that other people can put eyes on it, add their, insight to it, that sort of thing, to help make more sense of it. So that's kind of the both sides of it. Yes, I find it beneficial, and having those, kind of the communication and the peer review in place helps in that scenario where somebody's not sure what they're looking at.
All right, thanks, Frank. If less experienced analysts are allowed to do more advanced work, how do you prevent them from messing things up?
To some extent, we don't. Messing things up, making mistakes is kind of part of the process of growth. And I don't mean that you only learn from failure. I don't think that statement is really the best, right? A lot of people throw that out and say you only learn best from failure. I don't necessarily agree with that, but failure is a part of life, and we accept that as a company. We own it. When we screw something up, we say, hey, I did that. And then we figure out ways that, is it something that was just purely human error, or was it something that there's a process, or can we put a technical control in place to make sure that it doesn't happen again? And so to some extent, we don't keep people from messing up, but then from the other side of it, we do have checks and balances in there. And so similar to how we do review of detections that are being pushed out to customers, if somebody's doing, say they want to make a detector change, whether that's a completely new detector to look for some type of activity, or they think that one of the ones that we have existing needs to be tuned, to be improved, then we have review processes in place for those. So all of our, and we've got a blog post about this out there, all of our detectors are done as code. And so we use a code repository and process through that to where things get pushed to the repository, they get reviewed, and then once it's reviewed, any changes made, that are necessary based on the review, then gets approved and merged in with the overall code base. So we have checks and balances in place to ensure that, the mistakes shouldn't be catastrophic, right? That's essentially the way that we go with it. We give the freedom to make the mistakes. When we do, we just work with that, but we try to make sure that we've got some checkpoints built in to help prevent things from being, disastrous.
All right, thank you. An attendee says, just wanted to say thank you for stating, own the mistake, learn from it, and grow. All right. How do your practices work? Are people assigned to those teams?
No, they are not. We may suggest to somebody based on kind of things that they've expressed interest in, or things that have kind of bubbled up to the surface as areas that they may have an interest or a kind of a conceptual grasp on, that sort of thing. But we don't appoint anybody or assign anybody to work on a specific team. So part of the reason that I ended up being responsible for our internal training and documentation was essentially because I kept bringing things up. Hey, why don't we do this way? hey, let's improve this document. That's, it's out of date. Let's fix this. That's not actually what we do. Let's, correct this over here. And so my boss basically said, hey, Frank, why don't you take this on? I think it's an important area and I think you'd be good at it. So that's how a lot of the stuff has come to pass, both with the people leading the practices as well as the people who are working on those. And somebody can be part of multiple practices as well. Obviously, we don't have the same person leading multiple practices, but the people participating in those can be on multiple ones, because it's not it's not a full-time job. That's just simply part of what we do.
All right, thank you. If new people are expected to do the same work as experienced ones, how can they get through everything fast enough? Kind of a variation on an earlier question.
Yeah, and again, while so many places focused on how fast you can get through because of SLAs, right? To me, SLAs are kind of like the whole tier one deal. I get it. I understand why people do it, but you have to look at kind of what's the problem that we're trying to solve? What's the actual thing that's important to us? And yes, we do have measurements that we use internally as far as making sure that we are getting detections pushed out to customers in a timely fashion. That's very important, right? Both for customers and for us. But it's not, from our standpoint internally, it's not how fast can you get through things. It's making sure that we've got the quality there. It's making sure that when that does go out to a customer, that it's actionable. The customer can look at the detection, the timeline of activity, know exactly what's going on, and start taking action on it. Ultimately, perhaps even with automation. So for us, it's not about making sure that these new people can get through the stuff fast enough, or as fast as an experienced analyst. They're going to get there. Starting off, we don't expect that anybody's going to be there. It takes time. Again, going to the point of, if it takes a year to start recouping the investment off of that new hire, it's going to take time for people to learn and kind of ingest and internalize all the things, right? So we're not measuring analyst performance on that. Obviously, if somebody's not doing anything, then we're going to address that, but we're not measuring it from that perspective.
All right, thanks. I think we have time for one last question. How much time do you allow for new hires to learn all the things?
So we don't have anything hard and fast on that. And I don't know, honestly, that any of the people on our team know all the things at this point. Even the people who have been here the longest, the original analysts that started off that are still here, I don't think they know all the things. And part of that's because all the things change over time. So the stuff that they knew from before I started, some of it's no longer relevant because we've changed those processes. So we don't really have something hard and fast. There's not a milestone. It's like, well, by this date, within 3 months or 6 months or a year or whatever, that you have to know X, Y, and Z. We don't really have that. And so far, that hasn't proven to be an issue.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Frank, for your great presentation.